is so much misinformation on the internet about grinding your woodworking tools. People say that if you use a standard, high-speed, dry grinder, you're gonna ruin your blades, you're gonna soften the steel, and it's never gonna hold an edge ever again. You need a fancy, slow-speed, water-cooled grinder, or diamond-encrusted CBM wheels, or something like that. Well, good news. None of that is true. And more good news, you actually don't need a grinder at all. You can get an inexpensive honing guide like this one, glue some sandpaper down to a flat surface, and grind your tools that way. You will get exactly the same result. The thing about electric grinders, though, is that they're fast. They're incredibly fast, and especially if you get a nick or a chip in your blade, an electric grinder can get you woodworking again in a couple of minutes, and they're pretty affordable. So if they work so quick and they're affordable, there has to be a downside, right? Well, yeah, a high-speed electric grinder can damage your blade. It probably won't, but it can. Here's why. Basic tool steel is just iron plus carbon, and if it has the right amount of carbon, you can heat it up to a high temperature and then cool it down really fast. That's called quenching. And after quenching, the iron and the carbon are combined together in this really special way that makes the steel super hard, and it'll hold an edge much longer than a plain unhardened steel. The only problem with hardening is that it also makes the steel really brittle, so it'll crack or chip really easily. So tool makers have a second step to deal with that. They heat the steel up again to a lower temperature and then cool it down. The second step is called tempering, and you lose a little hardness in tempering, but you pick up toughness and flexibility. So hardening plus tempering together are called heat treating. And if you have a piece of high carbon steel that's been heat treated, it's going to hold an edge a long time, and that edge is also going to be durable, and it won't chip or crack. And the cool thing about steel is that it can actually be hardened and softened again over and over. It's amazing, really. And you're probably catching on to the problem. A high-speed electric grinder heats up your blades, and that has the danger of ruining the heat treatment. It's called drawing the temper. And it can happen, sort of, but it's a lot less likely than people make it out to be. And good news, we are going to teach you how to use inexpensive grinders to grind your tools quickly and never, ever ruin them. Oh, and real quick, grinding is not sharpening. It's part of a three-step sharpening process: grinding, honing, and polishing. Grinding gives you a straight edge and an even bevel at a known angle. Then honing, usually on stones, makes that edge actually sharp, but it generally leaves a burr, and polishing takes that burr off. Almost all sharpening systems have these three steps in there somewhere, and you shouldn't expect to go from your grinder straight to the work, unless you're wood turning, and that's a totally different thing. I do all of my grinding on a 6-inch 3400 RPM grinder. These are the cheapest, and they're everywhere. You can find good vintage grinders at yard sales. No matter what grinder you use, you need a good tool rest, and it's got to adjust two ways. You need the angle to be adjustable, and it needs to be able to adjust in and out. Cheap grinders like this Wen have a terrible tool rest that will not do the job. Same thing with this Shop Fox grinder. This tool rest is garbage. And we're going to review some aftermarket tool rests later in the video if you want to improve one of these cheaper grinders. Before you grind, whether you've got a new machine or a used machine, you need to dress the wheels. That trues them up and gets them into the correct shape. Set your grinding platform flat, and then you're going to need a wheel dresser. I use this old Star dresser, but there's a bunch of options, and I'll link to some of them down in the description. Set your dresser on that platform. It'll probably have little feet for this purpose, and then press it into the wheel with medium pressure. You'll be able to tell when the wheel is running true because the vibration you feel in your hands will change. There'll be less of it and it'll be more even. Once you have the wheel flat and true, you're going to focus on the edges, taking them back a little bit and then sweeping that dressing tool in a shallow arc. This is called crowning the wheel, and it's kind of like cambering a plane blade. You just want a smooth, subtle curve across the face of the wheel. This way, when you go to grind, you're only going to have one point of contact with the grinding wheel. This gives you more control over the grinding with less heat buildup. Once you've got your grinder bolted down with a good tool rest and you've dressed the grinding wheels, you are ready to grind your plane irons and chisels. I hope it's obvious, but we're doing all of this dressing and setup with safety glasses and probably breathing protection, and these are just as important when you do your actual grinding. First, you're going to need to set the angle of your tool rest. I like to use a simple jig just made from a piece of paint stirrer. I used my protractor to cut off the corner at 25 degrees. I grind pretty much everything at 25 degrees. Now, this is important. That angle gauge needs to touch the wheel at the bottom of the angle, down there at the apex, not the middle or the top. Your blade is going to touch the wheel down at the bottom, so that's what matters. And then, with the grinder turned on, put your blade on the tool rest and then move it up until the edge touches the wheel just lightly. Keep that light contact and sweep the tool back and forth gently. I always keep my thumbs close to the edge of the tool, and that allows me to feel when the blade is heating up. And after a short amount of time, I take it off the grinder, dunk it in water, and swirl that blade around. That really helps to dissipate heat. I always grind in short sessions, maybe 10 or 15 seconds in between dunks in the water, and it's really important to know that you don't need to grind your blade all the way to the edge. You can leave a very small flat spot right there at the tip and take that off with your sharpening stones. If you're grinding until you feel a burr on the back of the blade, you're grinding further than you need to, and you're much more likely to burn that edge and draw the temper. And after you're done grinding, you can double check that angle with an angle gauge like the Hand Tool Hero. We have a built-in angle finder at 25 degrees, and this blade is perfect. Now, I know you're probably still really paranoid about overheating that blade and drawing the temper, and I've got a bunch more tips on how to avoid that. First, you're much more likely to burn the corners of your blade. People tend to pause at the corners when they're changing directions, and there's less steel there to absorb heat. So, anytime you're grinding a blade, bring it up to the wheel in the center of the blade, sweep back and forth to the corners, stop again in the center, and then take it off the wheel. And of course, pause for the shortest amount of time possible. You want to keep that blade moving as much as you can. And then a lot of times you've got a blade where the edge is no longer square to the side, and that's a real problem. When you're straightening a wonky edge, I suggest you set your tool rest parallel to the floor, and then bring your blade in and grind just the very tip until you get it square. That way you have the minimum amount of steel in contact with the wheel, and you're much less likely to burn it. And then once that blade is square to the side again, you can reset your tool rest to your 25 or 30 degrees and grind the bevel. It's also super important to realize that the longer you grind a tool, even if you're dunking it, the tool itself heats up. You're going to feel the whole thing getting warm in your hand. The warmer the blade is, the more likely you are to burn the edge. So, the longer you're doing a tool, grind it for shorter periods of time, sometimes just one pass back and forth between dunks in the water. If you're doing a lot of tools or a heavy tool, the water itself will start to heat up, and warm water doesn't cool a blade down as effectively. So test that water once in a while. If it feels room temperature, get rid of it and replace it with cold water. Now, sometimes you have a tool that's really heating up, and even dunking it isn't really doing anything anymore because there's a lot of heat stored in that. Then you want to set it down on a piece of cast iron. Cast iron is an amazing heat sink, and in just a couple of minutes, it's going to cool that whole blade back down to the temperature it was when you started, and you can get back to grinding. Even if you're really careful, you will probably burn an iron or chisel at some point, and that is no big deal. And to demonstrate that, I am now going to intentionally burn the iron off of my favorite number 4 vintage Sweetheart Stanley plane. I'm going to start off doing a regular grind, but let extra heat build up in that corner until I see the steel change color. Really important, I'm going to dunk that right away the second I see the color change. You can clearly see that yellow and blue discoloration right there in the corner. This blade is definitely burned. So I'm going to set my tool rest flat to minimize more heat buildup, and I'm just going to grind straight in and grind away all of that discolored steel, or maybe just most of it, because the next thing I'm going to do is reset the tool rest to the correct angle and grind a new bevel, and that'll take care of any little bits of leftover discolored steel. Then I'm going to take it over to my sharpening stones, hone and strop, just like I normally would. And here's that blade back in my plane, and this is a piece of white oak, and clearly I've been planing it for quite a while. The blade is cutting great. It's leaving an excellent surface. It's definitely not getting dull sooner or losing its edge, so the edge retention is just fine. I burned this blade, but then I fixed it quickly and easily, and now it's totally normal again. And at this point, a bunch of people are yelling at their screens, "Rex, why aren't you talking about the water-cooled, slow-speed Tormac, the glass and sandpaper-powered Worksharp, or CBM wheels encrusted with industrial diamonds?" And the answer is, I think all of that stuff is nonsense and a total waste of money. I don't grind my tools very often, and I use simple techniques to prevent burning them. So I don't burn them basically ever. And then if you do burn a tool by accident, it's very easy to fix. I can't imagine throwing a bunch of money at one of these expensive systems to solve a problem that kind of doesn't exist. And if you're nervous about grinding your tools, grab an inexpensive block plane blade or a beater chisel from the flea market and just practice with that. Get good at it before you use your more expensive tools. You can learn grinding techniques very quickly, and a 6-inch high-speed grinder is good for so many more tasks around the shop than just grinding your tools. You can also reshape tools, make new tools, you can adjust hardware, grind a little bit off that hinge that doesn't fit. You can do a ton of stuff with one of those small high-speed grinders. I use the coarse gray wheels that just come with my grinder. The coarse ones actually heat the steel up less because the grains of abrasive are bigger and there's more space in between them, so there's more room for heat to dissipate. If you need to put new wheels on your high-speed grinder, the one upgrade I'd recommend is Norton makes these wheels called the 3X wheel that fit on a regular 6-inch grinder and are made to run at high speeds, and they run much cooler. They do wear down a little faster, but they're also very affordable. So if you have to replace wheels, that's a good choice. Although I don't use those, I just use the wheels that came with my grinder. So all you need is that high-speed grinder and a good tool rest. And speaking of tool rests, as I'm sure you can tell, these tool rests are extremely similar. They're probably made in the same factory and they use a lot of the same parts. In fact, there are only 2 small differences between them. The Savanah has a little bit of a rougher surface finish. I don't mean to nitpick, but you can really feel the difference, and it's not very pleasant while you're adjusting it. And then the Savanah adjusts 3 ways. You can slide the rest back and forth on that base, you can move it up and down on those arms, and you can pivot the actual platform itself. That is all the adjustment you need. It's totally great, and you can always get the angle that you're looking for, but the Tay has a couple of small advantages. For one thing, the surface finish is noticeably better. They clearly paid a couple extra bucks to have the parts tumbled, and you can tell. And then it adjusts all the same way the Savanah does, except the arms that connect the platform to the uprights, those arms actually pivot, so you can swing them in an arc. It's not necessary, but it is handy. At one point, while I was testing these out, I noticed that I had my angle and everything perfect, but the tool rest was too close to the base, and the end of my plane blade was hitting against the table. Because of those pivoting arms, it was really easy to rejigger everything, still get the right angle, but not have to change any of the other adjustments. So the TLDR is both of these rests are basically equally good. I like the Tay Tools rest a tiny bit more, and the Savanah costs 40 bucks and the Tay costs $46. So if you'd like to spend the extra $6, you probably get $6 more tool. And in case I haven't mentioned it yet, I think this Wen grinder is an unforgivable piece of garbage, and I definitely do not think you should buy it. I am literally going to dumpster this thing after this video is over. This grinder is too crappy to give away. I don't want any of my friends using it. Now, I did recommend a bunch of aftermarket tool rests, but the aftermarket tool rests only make sense if you've already got a grinder, if you found a cheap one, or if somebody gave one to you. If you need to buy a grinder and a tool rest, the economics do not work out. The cheapest grinder plus the cheapest tool rest costs the same as this DeWalt grinder, which I reviewed in my previous video and which I actually really liked for, I don't know, $120, something like that. It is a much bigger, much more robust machine. The wheels are higher up, the guards have a far better design, and it comes with a tool rest, a legitimately good tool rest. So if you get this grinder, you don't have to buy anything else. You can put a grinding wheel on one side, use the one that it comes with, or I put a replacement wheel on because the balancing was kind of iffy, and then an inexpensive wire wheel on the other side, and you're ready to go for like a bazillion shop tasks. I talked about a million products in this video, so I will link to everything I actually recommend down in the description. Oh, and before I go, I know we haven't made very many videos this year, and the reason is because I was sick. I got an upper respiratory infection, and I have asthma, so I was sick for like 5 weeks. I heard a lot of chatter around the internet that like we're not making videos anymore, or all we care about is the tool company now, and none of that is true. I was just sick for over a month, and that's why we weren't making videos. We are looking forward to a long year full of projects and tool reviews and all the stuff that we usually do, and we really hope you'll join us. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Patreon.com/Rex Krueger for early access, a wonderful community, and a bunch of free perks, and we will see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks for watching.